directive for all media, of course, is protect your sources at all costs. Go to prison to protect them if necessary as a journalist. Or they are indeed a publisher, and if the mainstream media then condemns WikiLeaks and allows Julian Assange to be extradited and stigmatized and imprisoned for publishing, they are also all vulnerable to the same treatment for publishing the same material, which the New York Times did. So they're trying to have it both ways, trying to have their cake and eat it, and they are putting themselves in legal jeopardy as well by doing so. They are so short-sighted in their lack of support for Julian Assange and for WikiLeaks. I can't believe they don't understand the principles.
There may be some signs of change on that front, as I said, because, of course, the material that was published by Assange was regularly featured on the front page in splash by both the New York Times and the Guardian and publications in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. So either all of them are guilty or none of them are guilty, surely.
Absolutely. And the fact they seem to be so short-sighted about this issue, that if WikiLeaks is going to be stigmatized and prosecuted and punished for publishing true information, and let's bear in mind, everything they've published so far, nothing has ever been disproven. It's been 100% accurate. How many other media outlets can claim that record?
Not many.
Yeah. So if they get punished for doing their job, what on earth is going to happen to all these other mainstream media outlets across the planet? They are all going to be legally vulnerable, and they will be legally vulnerable under, I suppose, this sort of self-perpetuating US global legal hegemony. Yeah. You know, have a situation where America feels it can prosecute anyone, anywhere around the planet for stuff done on the internet.
But if they do so, does their right on the First Amendment apply? Is there not such a...
The First Amendment is the freedom of expression under the US Constitution. Absolutely. Julian should be protected under that. There's no doubt about it. Particularly
as Ellsberg was in the famous Pentagon Papers case.
And more importantly as well, I mean, Ellsberg was an American, so he's allowed first constitution rights. The legal question is, if you're non-American, not resident in America, do you get protected in that way? Now, we do know that happens because, do you remember Christopher Steele, the former MI6 intelligence officer who published the so-called dirty dossier on Donald Trump? He was then sued by some Russians who were mentioned in this dossier for libel in the American courts. And he was actually granted First Amendment rights by the American court, even though he's a British subject living in Britain.
Wow.
So now they're saying Julian Assange is an Australian subject living in Britain, and he can't have the same First Amendment rights for publishing the truth.
Well, that'll have to be tested in the US courts, of course, but for now we're in the British courts. What are the possibilities, what would be the arguments that Assange's legal team will advance against his extradition?
I think there are a number of different approaches they can take. One is that the disproportionality of what he might face under the American legal system to what he would face under the British legal system for being a publisher of whistleblower material, allegedly. I think that's very good grounds for not having him extradited, but I understand that the case that was cut between the American government and the British government was that he would not face the death penalty. Well, that's good of them, right? Because Britain can't extradite people to a country that will impose the death penalty. In terms of his right as a publisher, I think his lawyers should go big on this particular front. And I think there should be a moral duty amongst all the other mainstream media that has fed relentlessly on the information WikiLeaks has put out over the last decade. They've made headlines, they've made fortunes, they've increased their sales. Exactly. They have a moral duty to protect a fellow publisher, a fellow journalist, who, let's not forget, has won multiple high-profile journalism awards around the planet over the last decade for his work in publishing information. So
it's difficult to conclude other than that we live in more arid times for whistleblowers and those who would publish their material. The New York Times famously ran the Pentagon Papers, and the man who leaked it, Daniel Ellsberg, was acquitted at every level in the US justice system. Back then, The Guardian was a liberal, progressive newspaper. All kinds, yes, I'm old enough to remember it. All kinds of things have changed, including the law, at least the law that's in the pipeline, and not for the better.
Absolutely. So in the UK, we have a mishmash of different official secrecy acts that have come in over the last century, starting with the 1911 Act, which was put in place to stop treachery, to stop people betraying their country, particularly in a time of war. And if you were caught out as a traitor, you would face 14 years in prison. Then, of course, there were a series of whistleblower scandals in the 1980s, most notably Clive Ponting and Cathy Massiter. So a new law was put in place, the 1989 Official Secrecy Act, which was put in place specifically to prosecute whistleblowers. Section 1.1 of the Official Secrecy Act 1989 basically says if you're an intelligence officer or a notified person for the purposes of this act and you talk to someone outside your employer, you, without authority, you will face 2 years in prison. And also, if you're a journalist, you can potentially face 2 years in prison. However, we have the Law Commission now has put together a new white paper, and it's basically trying to consolidate all the different official secrecy acts from the last century. And they are recommending, one, that whistleblowers will face 14 years in prison, like a traitor, wow, that journalists could potentially face 14 years in prison as well, and that the ruling that came out of the spy catcher case in the 1980s, which says that if there's prior publication of a story, it can be republished without any legal penalty. They're trying to get rid of that too. So that would mean, for example, in the case of my story, I wouldn't be able to talk about stuff I've been talking about for the last 20 years. They could prosecute me for it and potentially put me in prison for 14 years. That's how crazy it's getting in this country. I mean, America has always been crazy when it comes to prosecuting whistleblowers. But in this country, it's getting really frightening.
What's your estimation of Assange's chances before the British courts and, if necessary, before the American?
I hope for the best, but I would expect the worst. I remember following the cases around his extradition back in 2011-12, and he was not given a fair hearing. The legal process in the UK is renowned for being fair. Having gone through many legal cases with my former partner, David Shaler, the MI5 whistleblower, I can tell you it's absolutely not necessarily fair. It's very much a sort of grandstanding play acting on the stage of a British courtroom. So I think probably his family should expect that he will be extradited.
Not necessarily fair, but as I said at the meeting in London we both addressed, the judiciary is, let me put it another way, I'd rather take my chances in front of a British judge than a British MP, a British minister, a British police officer, any of the other institutions, a British editor. I'd rather take my chances in front of a judge. Am I looking at that through rose-coloured spectacles, do you think?
I think there is an element of that. I mean, people think that British justice is entirely independent, and they are part of the same system. They're part of the establishment. They're part of the elite in the UK. And if it's a political prosecution, then they will tend to do what they are asked to do. And it's not some manifest corruption. It's just, they're all chaps in the same clubs and they have words with each other and, don't trust this person, they've done this, they've done that. So I think that does colour British justice. It is better than the American system, where, most people have to plea bargain to not spend the rest of their life in prison. But I don't think any justice system can be without bias in some way.
Annie Machon, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.